Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. The explosions began before dawn. Across Iran, radar stations and military compounds erupted in fire as American and Israeli aircraft launched their opening strikes. Air defense batteries struggled to respond while command centers scrambled to understand what was happening. Within hours, it was clear that a major war had begun. Tehran responded quickly with threats of retaliation. Iranian leaders warned that the Strait of Hormuz could be closed, and energy infrastructure across the Persian Gulf might soon become targets. Tanker routes, oil terminals, and pipelines across the region suddenly felt dangerously exposed. The war was no longer just about Iran. It threatened the global energy system itself. For years, analysts had believed that Iran would never face such a moment alone. The country was widely seen as part of a growing alignment of powers challenging Western dominance, a loose but powerful grouping that included Russia, China, and other governments hostile to the United States and its allies. If that alignment truly existed, this should have been the moment it revealed itself. American and Israeli forces were striking one of its supposed members. The expectation was simple. Moscow and Beijing would step forward to defend their partner. But as the hours passed, something strange happened. No Russian aircraft moved toward the region, no Chinese naval forces deployed. The war continued, and Iran fought it alone. Not long before the war began, Western analysts had started using a phrase that captured the growing unease of the mid-2020s, the axis of upheaval. It referred to a loose but increasingly visible alignment between four governments that often found themselves on the same side of global disputes: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Each of these nations had its own grievances with the Western-led international order. Russia was locked in a grinding war in Ukraine. China was asserting its power more aggressively in the Indo-Pacific. Iran was expanding its influence through regional militias and missile programs. North Korea continued testing increasingly capable ballistic missiles. Seen together, the pattern looked alarming. Across multiple regions, these countries appeared to be pushing against the same geopolitical boundaries, challenging the same alliances, and cooperating in ways that seemed more coordinated with each passing year. Military cooperation reinforced that perception. Russian forces began using Iranian-designed drones on the battlefield in Ukraine. Chinese and Russian naval fleets conducted joint exercises across the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. Diplomatic coordination between these states became increasingly common in international forums. To many observers, it felt like the early stages of a new geopolitical bloc, not identical to the alliances of the 20th century, but close enough to make the world nervous. If the so-called Axis truly existed, then Iran's war should have triggered a collective response. But the idea of that Axis rested on a dangerous misunderstanding. Cooperation between nations does not automatically mean they will fight for one another. The misunderstanding comes down to a distinction that often disappears in political commentary: the difference between partners and allies. The two may sound similar, but in the brutal reality of war, they mean very different things. Alliances create obligations. When countries sign a mutual defense treaty, they promise that if one is attacked, the others will come to its aid. NATO is the most famous example of this arrangement. Article 5 of the alliance states clearly that an attack on one member is treated as an attack on all. The relationships linking Russia, China, and Iran have never looked like that. There is no treaty binding them to fight together, no shared command structure, no guarantee that one nation will defend another if war breaks out. Instead, what exists between them is something looser: strategic alignment. These countries often cooperate where their interests overlap. They share military technology, coordinate diplomatically against Western pressure, and help each other soften the impact of sanctions. But cooperation is not the same thing as commitment. Nations can work together for years without ever agreeing to risk their own soldiers for the other's survival. And when Iran came under attack, that difference between working together and fighting together suddenly became impossible to ignore. Even without a formal alliance, many observers still believed Russia and China would not allow Iran to fall so easily. The reason had less to do with ideology and far more to do with geography. Iran occupies one of the most strategic positions on Earth. Sitting between Central Asia, the Middle East, and the Persian Gulf, Iran effectively overlooks some of the most important energy routes in the global economy. Just to its south lies the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passage through which a significant portion of the world's oil supply must travel every day. Any nation that influences this corridor holds a powerful lever over global markets. For decades, Iranian leaders understood this geographic advantage. Control over territory surrounding the strait allowed Tehran to threaten shipping lanes whenever tensions escalated. Even the possibility of disruption could rattle financial markets and send oil prices soaring. From a geopolitical perspective, that made Iran look like a valuable partner for powers hoping to challenge Western influence. Positioned at the intersection of major trade routes and energy corridors, the country appeared to be a perfect strategic counterweight in the Middle East. So when American and Israeli aircraft began striking Iranian targets, many analysts assumed Moscow and Beijing would see the crisis as a test of their broader geopolitical ambitions. If Iran collapsed, the balance of power in the region could shift dramatically. But events would soon show that strategic geography alone was not enough to guarantee anyone's protection. To understand Moscow's decision, it helps to look at how Russia has treated other partners when crises reached their breaking point. Vladimir Putin has spent years cultivating the image of a leader willing to confront the West wherever necessary. Yet when allied governments faced moments of real danger, Russia's response has often been far more cautious. One revealing example came in the Caucasus. Armenia had long relied on Russian security guarantees and the presence of Russian peacekeepers during its conflict with Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. But when Azerbaijan launched its decisive offensive and retook the disputed territory, Moscow did little more than watch. The Russian forces stationed in the region remained largely passive as the balance of power shifted. A similar pattern appeared in the Middle East. During the Syrian civil war, Russia provided crucial support to Bashar al-Assad earlier in the conflict, but as instability returned in later years, Moscow became increasingly reluctant to deepen its military commitment. Support continued diplomatically and through limited military presence, yet Russia showed little appetite for escalating the situation further. The same cautious approach appeared elsewhere. When political crises threatened longtime partners in places like Venezuela, Russia responded with strong rhetoric but limited action. Statements condemning Western influence were easy to issue. Direct military intervention was far more complicated. These episodes reveal something important about Russia's strategic mindset. Moscow is willing to cooperate with many governments that oppose the West, but when the cost of defending those partners becomes too high, the Kremlin often chooses restraint over confrontation. Despite that pattern, Iran appeared to many observers to be a special case. Over the previous several years, the relationship between Moscow and Tehran had grown closer than almost anyone expected. What began as cautious cooperation gradually evolved into something that looked much more like a strategic partnership. The turning point came after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. As Western sanctions tightened around Moscow, Iran emerged as one of the few countries willing to deepen military cooperation. Iranian-designed one-way attack drones, particularly the Shahed series, quickly became a familiar presence on the Ukrainian battlefield. These drones proved valuable not because they were sophisticated, but because they were cheap and easy to produce. Russia adapted the designs, began manufacturing versions domestically, and used them to pressure Ukrainian infrastructure in large numbers. The cooperation demonstrated a level of military collaboration between the two countries that few analysts had expected. Beyond drones, the relationship appeared to be expanding in other ways as well. Discussions circulated about Russian transfers of advanced fighter aircraft and air defense systems to Iran, while both governments signed broader security agreements promising deeper cooperation in the years ahead. To outside observers, the partnership looked stronger than many of Russia's other international relationships. Iran had supported Moscow during one of the most difficult periods in modern Russian history. If Russia would ever repay that loyalty with meaningful support, this seemed like the moment it would happen. But when the crisis finally arrived, Moscow's response showed that even this partnership had clear limits. When the bombing of Iran began, Moscow reacted almost immediately, but only in the diplomatic arena. Russian officials condemned the strikes in some of the strongest language available, accusing the United States and Israel of destabilizing the Middle East and risking a dangerous escalation across the region. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov reportedly spoke with Iranian officials soon after the first attacks, offering sympathy and verbal support. Russian media echoed the same message, portraying the campaign as an act of aggression against a sovereign nation. When Iranian sources confirmed that the country's supreme leader had been killed in the opening strikes, Vladimir Putin publicly condemned the act as political murder. From the outside, these statements sounded dramatic, but behind the scenes, the signals coming from Moscow were far quieter. The Kremlin convened its Security Council to review the situation, yet the military response never moved beyond discussion. More telling was the silence along the military channels. The communication lines that might normally connect Russian and Iranian commanders remained inactive. There were no reports of operational planning, no coordination between armed forces, and no preparations for joint action. In other words, Russia's reaction stopped exactly where the real risks would have begun. Moscow protested loudly, but it carefully avoided taking any step that might pull its own military into the conflict. Behind Moscow's cautious response was a set of hard military realities. By the mid-2020s, Russia was already deeply entangled in the war in Ukraine, a conflict that had consumed enormous amounts of manpower, equipment, and political attention. Opening a second confrontation against the United States and Israel would have stretched the Russian military far beyond what it could realistically sustain. Geography made the problem even worse. Iran lies roughly 3,000 kilometers from Moscow, and projecting meaningful military power across that distance requires logistics Russia simply does not possess. There is no secure land corridor connecting Russian territory directly to Iran, no chain of large forward air bases capable of sustaining a major air campaign, and no naval infrastructure nearby that could challenge American carrier groups operating in the Persian Gulf. Without those foundations, intervention would not simply be risky, it would be nearly impossible to sustain. Even if Russian aircraft could reach the region, maintaining air superiority against American and Israeli forces would require a logistical network that Moscow does not currently control. Russia also faced mounting pressure on other fronts. Sanctions from Western nations were tightening, and the Kremlin was trying to preserve delicate relationships with energy producers in the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Supporting Iran while it threatened energy infrastructure across the region would have jeopardized partnerships that Moscow could not afford to lose. Seen from the Kremlin's perspective, the calculation became brutally simple. However frustrating Iran's defeat might be, confronting the United States and Israel over it offered little strategic benefit and enormous risk. In that equation, stepping aside was the safer choice. If Russia's hesitation could be explained by military limitations, China appeared to be in a very different position. Beijing was not fighting a major war, its economy was larger, its military was expanding rapidly, and its global influence had grown steadily throughout the 2000s. On paper, China looked far more capable of assisting Iran than Russia did. But China approaches international conflicts with a very different philosophy. For decades, Beijing has followed an informal but remarkably consistent rule in its foreign policy. China does not go to war for other countries. Even as its military power has expanded, Chinese leaders have remained extremely cautious about committing troops to conflicts that are not directly tied to China's own territorial interests. This approach has deep historical roots. Since its brief border conflict with Vietnam in 1979, China has avoided large-scale foreign wars entirely. Instead of military intervention, Beijing prefers to expand influence through trade, investment, and long-term economic partnerships. That strategy allows China to build relationships across multiple regions without becoming trapped in costly military commitments. Countries may cooperate with China economically or diplomatically, but they are rarely given guarantees that Beijing will defend them if war breaks out. When the bombing of Iran began, this doctrine shaped China's response almost immediately. Chinese officials condemned the strikes and called for restraint, urging negotiations and political solutions. Yet behind the diplomatic language was a clear signal. Beijing had no intention of entering the war. At first glance, China's relationship with Iran might have suggested a stronger response. Over the past decade, the two countries had built increasingly close economic ties, particularly as Western sanctions pushed Tehran to search for alternative partners. China became the primary destination for Iranian oil exports, often purchasing the fuel at discounted prices that benefited both sides. These energy shipments were only part of a broader relationship. Beijing and Tehran had also announced a sweeping long-term cooperation agreement tied to China's Belt and Road Initiative. On paper, the plan envisioned hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure investment, linking Iranian transport networks, ports, and energy facilities with China's wider Eurasian trade routes. Military cooperation had also begun to grow. China had supplied Iran with certain missile technologies and air defense systems, while both countries participated in occasional joint naval exercises alongside Russia. Taken together, these developments made Iran appear to be an increasingly important partner in China's expanding global network. From the outside, it was easy to imagine why observers thought Beijing might intervene if Iran came under attack. The country sat along major trade routes connecting Asia to the Middle East and Europe, and its energy exports helped fuel China's rapidly growing economy. But appearances can be misleading. Even though China valued its relationship with Iran, that relationship existed within a much larger web of economic and strategic interests across the Middle East. And within that broader picture, Iran was only one piece of a far larger puzzle. To understand Beijing's calculation, it helps to look at the broader map of China's energy security. Nearly half of China's imported oil originates from the Persian Gulf, and most of it travels through vulnerable sea lanes before reaching Chinese ports. The stability of this region is therefore not a distant concern for Beijing. It is a core economic lifeline. Iran supplies a portion of that energy, but it is far from China's largest partner. Countries such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar collectively export far more oil and gas to China than Iran does. These states also host enormous Chinese investments in ports, industrial zones, and infrastructure tied to Beijing's global trade network. When the conflict began escalating, Iran's threats to close the Strait of Hormuz and its strikes against regional energy infrastructure suddenly changed the strategic picture. If those attacks disrupted Gulf oil production or tanker traffic, the shock would hit China's economy before almost anyone else's. There was another geographical reality as well. Much of China's imported oil must travel not only through the Strait of Hormuz, but also through the narrow Strait of Malacca before reaching East Asia. This vulnerability, often called China's Malacca dilemma, means that instability along these routes can quickly become a national security crisis for Beijing. From this perspective, defending Iran began to look less like a strategic necessity and more like a dangerous gamble. Supporting Tehran militarily risked alienating the Gulf states that supply most of China's energy and host hundreds of thousands of Chinese citizens. In the cold arithmetic of geopolitics, Iran's survival simply was not worth jeopardizing those larger interests. In the end, Iran's isolation was not the result of sudden betrayal. It was the result of a misunderstanding that had been building for years. Tehran believed that its growing partnerships with Russia and China meant something close to an alliance, a shared front against the Western world. But when the moment of crisis arrived, those relationships revealed their true nature. Moscow condemned the attacks and offered sympathy, yet avoided any military commitment. Beijing called for restraint and negotiations while carefully protecting its own economic interests across the region. Neither power had ever promised to fight for Iran, and when the risks of intervention became clear, both governments followed the same quiet logic. Protecting Iran would mean confronting the United States and its allies directly, a conflict neither Moscow nor Beijing believed was worth the cost. For Russia, the war in Ukraine had already stretched its military and political resources to the limit. For China, the stability of global trade routes and Gulf energy supplies mattered far more than preserving one embattled partner. The result was the same from Tehran's perspective. In the moment when it needed powerful allies the most, none arrived. The countries that once seemed to stand beside Iran did not turn against it. They simply stepped aside. In geopolitics, loyalty rarely determines the outcome of events. Interests do. And when the bombs began to fall, the interests of Moscow and Beijing pointed in only one direction, away from Iran.